The Old West is often portrayed as a rugged, untamed land, where danger lurked at every corner and the rules of civilization seemed far removed. But as wild as it was, the so-called justice of the time might shock you even more. With few laws, even fewer lawmen, and the harsh realities of frontier life, the Old West was a place where justice could be as unpredictable as a desert storm. Whether it was the fast draw of a gunslinger or the corrupt dealings of a sheriff, the pursuit of justice often took a back seat to power, violence, and survival. If you thought the Wild West was wild, wait until you discover the twisted tales of its justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the fascinating and often brutal truths of life in the Old West. Homicide rates in the Old West were extremely high. During the 19th century, the American West saw alarmingly high rates of violent death, with homicide figures that rivaled the bloodshed experienced in the southern United States during the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. The rapid expansion of settlements, coupled with a lack of law enforcement, meant that residents of frontier towns faced a particularly dangerous existence. In Dodge City, Kansas, from 1876 to 1885, the mortality rate for adults was particularly high. Statistically, an individual had a 1 in 61 chance of dying in a violent incident, highlighting the extreme challenges of living in such a volatile environment. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, California, between 1850 and 1865, the chance of a resident meeting an untimely end was somewhat lower but still troubling, with a 1 in 203 likelihood of dying in a violent manner. Other areas in California experienced similarly dangerous conditions, with some counties reporting a 1 in 72 chance of violent death. However, not all areas in the West were marked by such extreme levels of violence. Oregon, for instance, had the lowest homicide rate in the region from 1850 to 1865, with a considerably safer 1 in 208 chance of dying violently. This disparity in homicide rates across different territories reflects not only the varying levels of law enforcement and social order, but also the unique challenges faced by each frontier community. These statistics paint a vivid picture of the deadly realities of frontier life, underscoring the risks faced by settlers who moved west in search of a new life. The violence, often the result of disputes, lawlessness, and an absence of government authority, was a harsh reminder of the rough and unforgiving nature of the American frontier. The vigilantes took justice into their own hands. When tensions ran high and public outrage erupted over a particular incident, some settlers in the West took matters into their own hands, bypassing official legal channels. These so-called vigilantes were often portrayed as heroes in contemporary accounts, seen as defenders of justice in an otherwise lawless land. However, the actions they carried out were frequently harsh and extreme. Vigilante justice did not stop at arresting and punishing those deemed guilty. In many cases, the accused were subjected to cruel treatment, often as a way to exact what the vigilantes considered proper retribution. This form of self-appointed justice often lacked the procedures and safeguards found in a legal system, which made it all the more volatile and unpredictable. In some particularly disturbing instances, vigilantes went beyond simply dealing with the accused. In 1891, for example, after a bandit was hanged and transformed into souvenirs. This gruesome act reflected not just a desire for retribution, but an unsettling need to memorialize and display the violent outcome of their justice. Vigilantes often justified their actions by pointing to the perceived severity of the crimes committed by the accused, whether they were robbery or other serious crimes. In their eyes, the lack of swift, formal justice left them with no choice but to take matters into their own hands. This mindset was fueled by the deep mistrust many settlers had of the slow-moving and sometimes ineffective legal systems of frontier towns, where lawmen were few and far between. The vigilantes themselves became a law unto themselves, imposing their version of justice in ways that could be just as dangerous as the crimes they sought to punish. Most convictions ended in swift executions. In the Wild West, the life expectancy of individuals convicted of crimes, particularly those accused of murder, often plummeted after their conviction. The legal system of the frontier was often swift and unforgiving, and the expectation of a lengthy trial or appeals was rare. Whether a criminal faced an official trial or the wrath of vigilantes, justice in the West was frequently driven by a demand for retribution. In California, for example, the justice system operated at a rapid pace. Offenders were often convicted in summary trials and sentenced to hang at the local county courthouse. The process moved quickly, with executions often taking place shortly after the conviction. This was due in part to the fact that appeals or delays in execution were uncommon, leaving little room for the convicted to challenge their fate. The speed of the proceedings was a direct result of the tense, lawless environment where swift action was seen as a necessity for maintaining order. However, when executions were delayed or did not occur as swiftly as the public expected, vigilantes could take matters into their own hands. These self-appointed enforcers of justice were not afraid to step in when the official justice system did not deliver the outcome they anticipated. In one notable case in 1851, a man accused of stealing gold dust was convicted by vigilantes. He was given only 3 hours to settle his affairs, reflecting the harsh and often arbitrary nature of frontier justice. While some saw this quick form of justice as a way to ensure stability in a turbulent time, it also left room for errors and abuses. The lack of due process and the absence of safeguards for the accused meant that many were condemned without sufficient evidence or a fair trial. Death in the line of duty. The American West had a wide range of law enforcement officials, from local sheriffs and town marshals to the more formal U.S. Marshals, who were appointed by the federal attorney general. The U.S. Marshals had the critical responsibility of upholding federal laws across the frontier, and they often relied on the assistance of local men, deputizing them to form posses when their efforts required greater numbers. These lawmen were tasked with maintaining order in a landscape rife with violence and instability. However, the dangers of law enforcement in the West were ever present, and deaths in the line of duty became sadly common. The U.S. Marshals faced numerous deadly encounters, with some of the most notorious incidents involving high casualties. For instance, in 1872, a group of lawmen, including a marshal and 7 of his posse, were tragically killed when they attempted to remove a prisoner from the jurisdiction of a Cherokee court. This event serves as a reminder of the complex relationships between federal, local, and indigenous legal systems during this period. Another deadly encounter occurred in 1885, when a deputy marshal and 3 members of his posse found themselves embroiled in a violent shootout. Just 2 years later, in 1887, a deputy marshal and 2 posse members lost their lives during a prisoner escape attempt. Then, in 1893, 2 deputy marshals and a posse member were killed in a similar confrontation. These incidents were not isolated, but part of a broader trend of high-risk law enforcement work on the frontier. These tragic events highlight the perilous nature of maintaining law and order in the Old West. The volatile mix of lawlessness, violence, and often sparse populations made the work of lawmen extremely dangerous. Gun control. The Old West was notorious for its widespread access to firearms, which created a significant challenge for lawmen who were tasked with maintaining order and preventing violence. As a result, many towns in the region implemented gun control measures to reduce the risks associated with the heavy presence of weapons. This approach was widely adopted as a practical solution to ensure safety and prevent escalating conflicts. In towns like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas, visitors were required to surrender their firearms upon entering. This regulation was strictly enforced, as town officials understood the potential dangers of allowing individuals to carry weapons in public spaces. The well-known 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, for example, stemmed from a confrontation in which Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers refused to relinquish their guns, defying the town's rules. This act of defiance led to a dramatic and deadly clash, underscoring the high stakes of ignoring the town's gun laws. In these frontier towns, adherence to gun control laws was considered essential for maintaining peace, and anyone caught disregarding these regulations faced serious consequences. Often, the penalty for not complying was severe, reflecting the community's commitment to controlling weapons and preventing violent encounters. The importance of these gun laws was highlighted by author and cowboy Andy Adams in his 1903 account of life in Dodge City. Adams described how the town's gun laws were enforced with strict vigilance, noting that lawmen and town officials had little tolerance for anyone who violated these regulations. The rules were clear. Surrender your weapons or face the consequences. This sense of discipline was necessary in a time when law enforcement resources were limited and the threat of violence was ever present. Many offenses went unpunished. Many Western cities struggled with weak political structures and insufficient resources, which left them ill-equipped to manage the high crime rates that plagued the region. The limited capacity of the justice system to address offenses effectively often led to the rise of vigilante justice. In areas where law enforcement was sparse, individuals took matters into their own hands, creating a parallel system of justice that lacked oversight and due process. As settlers flocked to California during the gold rush, Los Angeles emerged as a particularly troubled area. The city's population, which numbered around 6,000 and was predominantly made up of young, single men, faced a crime rate that was higher than that of New York City at the time. The law enforcement system, stretched thin by the rapid population growth and the absence of organized political leadership, was unable to keep pace with the rising tide of criminal activity. The sheer volume of crimes committed created a significant challenge for local authorities, and many offenders went unpunished. As a result, there was a growing sense of insecurity among the residents and newcomers. One would-be settler, disillusioned by the lawlessness, remarked, "This place will not do for me. There is no security here. I dare not venture out after the dark of night has set in." This statement reflects the widespread fear and distrust of the system, as individuals felt vulnerable in an environment where justice was either delayed or entirely absent. This environment of uncertainty and danger fueled the sense that law and order were largely absent from many parts of the West, particularly in rapidly growing areas like Los Angeles. With a justice system struggling to address the volume of crimes, people began to rely more on their own means of protection, often leading to further unrest. Lawmen also turned to illegal activity. The Old West faced significant challenges with vigilante justice, but in some instances, the behavior of legitimate lawmen was no better. Many law enforcement officers were poorly compensated, often relying on a system where they only earned money through taking a percentage of fines or collecting bounties on wanted criminals. This reliance on irregular payments created an environment ripe for corruption, as some lawmen, faced with financial difficulties, turned to unlawful actions themselves. Corruption within law enforcement was not uncommon. For instance, Sheriff Dave Allison was repeatedly accused of embezzling public funds, demonstrating how easily the system could be exploited. Another example involved Henry Newton Brown, a deputy sheriff whose role was to track down fugitives for bounties. Instead of fulfilling his duties, Brown, along with 3 accomplices, took the opportunity to rob a bank, displaying how the line between enforcer and criminal could blur under the right circumstances. In this case, local vigilantes, who were often more willing to act outside the law than the official authorities, intervened by executing their own form of justice, leading to a tragic end. One of the more notorious figures in the law enforcement community was Timothy Longhair Jim Courtright, a former lawman who used his position to extort money from saloons and gambling houses in exchange for protection. His actions were a clear example of how some lawmen turned their power into personal gain, abusing the trust placed in them by the community. Courtright's criminal activities eventually caught up with him, leading to a dramatic confrontation with Luke Short, a former ally and saloon owner. Short refused to submit to Courtright's protection racket, and the conflict escalated into a deadly duel. These stories highlight the complex and often troubling relationship between law enforcement and justice in the Old West. While many officers were dedicated to their duties, the inconsistent payment structure and lack of oversight contributed to a culture of corruption where some lawmen were no different from the criminals they were supposed to apprehend. Gold Rush miners formed their own justice system. Mining camps in the Old West often faced significant challenges when it came to administering justice, primarily due to their isolation from established political systems and legal institutions. In many cases, these camps were far removed from any formalized government, and the usual structures of law enforcement were not available to maintain order. As a result, miners themselves sometimes took matters into their own hands, forming their own vigilance committees to uphold a semblance of justice in these remote areas. These committees often assumed the roles typically filled by formal legal systems, including that of judge, jury, and executioner. Volunteers within the mining communities were tasked with handling legal disputes and enforcing punishments, a practice born out of necessity in an environment where the rule of law was scarce. This self-reliance was vital to maintaining some sense of order in a place where the population was transient and the threats of crime and disorder were ever present. An 1851 account by settler Louise Clapp provides insight into how justice was carried out in the mining camps of Northern California. She describes a situation where a man was apprehended for stealing gold dust, an offense that was seen as serious enough to warrant immediate action. The miners quickly convened a meeting, and a jury, judge, and lawyers were appointed to handle the case. After a brief trial where the proceedings likely focused on expediency rather than thorough deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. The sentence was swift, illustrating how quickly the mining camps could move from accusation to punishment. The reliance on self-appointed justice in mining camps highlights the challenges of frontier life, where formal legal systems were either absent or impractical. It also speaks to the urgency with which miners sought to protect their valuable resources, like gold, and the lengths they were willing to go to ensure that criminals were swiftly dealt with, even in the absence of proper legal procedures. The aftermath of the Civil War. The violence and unrest of the Wild West were compounded by the after-effects of the American Civil War. The war not only ravaged the nation, but also left many men without a clear path forward. After the conflict, numerous veterans found themselves with few resources, relying on the gun handling skills they had honed during their military service. With the West offering the promise of new opportunities, many of these former soldiers sought to carve out a new life, bringing with them a readiness to resolve disputes through physical means, often involving firearms. This post-war migration of soldiers to the West contributed significantly to the violent climate of the era. Many of these men, who had been shaped by the brutal realities of war, found it difficult to adjust to civilian life. As a result, conflicts in the West were often settled in ways that reflected the lawlessness and unpredictability of the frontier. This atmosphere of tension and rivalry was further fueled by the deep divisions that lingered between former Union and Confederate soldiers. One notable example of this lingering animosity is the bitter rivalry between Wild Bill Hickok, a former Union soldier, and Dave Tutt, a former Confederate. Their conflict, rooted in personal and political differences, culminated in a fatal shootout. This tragic event illustrates how the wounds of the Civil War, both physical and emotional, continued to shape the lives of many individuals long after the war had ended. Private detectives. During the turbulent years of the Wild West, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency emerged as a prominent private organization, often hired to track down the most notorious criminals. Their reputation as effective bounty hunters grew as they took on high-profile cases, including the pursuit of the infamous Reno Gang after their notorious train robbery. The Pinkertons were also tasked with bringing down other notorious outlaws, such as Butch Cassidy and his gang, the Wild Bunch. Their success in infiltrating criminal networks was part of what made them so feared and respected. However, despite their impressive track record, the Pinkertons struggled to capture one of the most elusive criminals of the time, Jesse James. James, a former Confederate soldier turned outlaw, was known for his ability to evade capture, often using his cunning to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. The Pinkertons, with their vast resources and methods of investigation, pursued him relentlessly, but they could not bring him to justice. In their pursuit of James, the Pinkerton agency's tactics began to draw public criticism, particularly when it became clear that they would stop at nothing to apprehend him. One of the most controversial incidents occurred in 1875 when the Pinkertons raided the home of James's mother, hoping to capture him there. When they arrived, they threw an explosive device through the window of the house, intending to flush him out. However, James had already received word of the impending raid and fled. Tragically, the explosion killed James's 8-year-old half-brother and severely injured his mother, who lost part of her arm. This event marked a turning point for the Pinkertons. The public was outraged by the agency's ruthless tactics, and many began to question the methods they employed in their pursuit of criminals. The loss of public support forced the Pinkertons to reconsider their strategy, and they eventually called off the chase for James, recognizing that their methods had not only failed to capture their target, but also caused considerable harm to innocent individuals. Vigilantes sometimes took accused offenders from their jail cells. Even when law enforcement successfully apprehended suspects and they awaited their day in court, vigilante groups often lacked the patience to allow the legal system to run its course. Many such groups felt that swift action was necessary, fearing that delays or a potential acquittal could allow justice to slip through their fingers. In these cases, the desire for immediate retribution led them to bypass the judicial process entirely. One notable example of this occurred in 1878, when an individual accused of murder was captured and taken to jail, awaiting trial the following day. Despite the legal procedures set in motion, a group of 20 to 30 masked men gathered outside the jail that very night. Armed and determined, the vigilantes took matters into their own hands, removing the accused from his cell and dispensing their form of justice without trial or due process. The man had no opportunity to defend himself or to receive a fair trial before a judge. This incident exemplifies the tension between formal law enforcement and the widespread belief in the necessity of immediate justice that was prevalent in many Western communities. In the absence of a strong, centralized legal system, communities often turned to extra-legal measures to address perceived threats. Such actions were fueled by a combination of fear, frustration, and a desire for control in a chaotic and often lawless environment. As we've seen, the Old West was not just a land of outlaws and gunfights, but a place where the very concept of justice was often twisted and bent by desperation, lawlessness, and human nature. Whether it was the swift and brutal actions of vigilantes, the sometimes corrupt lawmen, or the lack of a consistent legal system, those who lived during this era were often left to fend for themselves when it came to seeking fairness. In many ways, the justice of the Old West was as dangerous as the lawless land itself, where survival was often more important than righteousness. If you found these tales of frontier justice fascinating, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join us as we continue to explore the untold stories, hidden truths, and shocking realities of life in the Old West.